Hello world and welcome to episode 22 of The Top Split. I'm your host Alex McKellar and today we're discussing the once again revamped Skippy and all things Sunday Night Lights so far. I am joined once again by Team Milo's own Benn Snell. Welcome back, Ben.
Hello.
First off, a new racing season brings another major change to the Skippy. Third or fourth season in a row, I think that's happened. And this time, though, the overwhelming response has been one of excitement at the progress that has been made with both the new tyre model and the general handling of the car. After what was essentially a season-long beta test in the Skippy Series last season, the iRacing team seemed to have taken on board a lot of the feedback and really taken a big step in the development of the two key elements of the car in the new tyre model and kind of how the Skippy drives in of itself. It's been extremely well received by many in the community and others, although others, including me, were a little bit apprehensive. But personally, I'm warming to the car. But I have been here for a reason. Ben, we spoke last season about what was then the new tyre model. I commended you at the time for sticking with the series despite how much the changes impacted your driving experience, similar to many others, I think, who have real-world track time under their belt. So now we have the new tyre model. Tell me, what are you making of it so far?
They've made Skippies great again. I'm really enjoying the new car. Obviously, with the notes that came out for what they did, talking about making some aerodynamic changes and some changes to the tyre model. It's definitely completely changed the behaviour of the car. Not so much under the limit, but definitely over the limit, which is where most people like myself are having issues. So the issues with the counter steering, where the car, if you counter steer to slide, would actually gain rotation speed instead of obviously nullifying the rotation like you'd want it to do. But under the limit, some of the issues are still there, like the stuff where there's a little bit too much front grip, a little bit too much grip overall for what people say the Skippy should have. But it's definitely steps in the right direction, Alex.
Yeah, mate, I wondered if, the issues that we saw with the physics last season were more to do with the aerodynamics of the car than it was the tyre model. Now, the tyre model, as you say, still has the grip stuff going on, but I wonder if they've just sort of toned down or corrected some of the changes that must have been made to the aero of the car that really just sort of threw physics out the window and left us with what we had last season.
Yeah, there's definitely other issues or other changes as well. Uh, the front of the car is higher than it was before, so obviously when they changed to the new tire model and the other undocumented changes they made, they definitely changed the caster and the height of the car. The nose was much lower, and we were having to run, 0 or negative SPOs to keep the front of the car off the ground, whereas now we're running much lower SPOs. So there is undocumented changes, which is the real frustrating thing about it, because we can't take exactly what they've said they've done for gospel, because obviously if you're looking at the way the car is set up and the way the car is driving, there are differences compared to what they said they've actually done.
Yeah, look, I agree with you in that so much. It's hard to you're left on your own when it comes to deciding how the car's going to handle under specific setups and what have you. And, you do have to take a good look at the setup page each time they roll out these changes, or even when you don't think there are going to be any changes, just because of those ride height differences and the camera and caster, which a few people have made, note of significantly. But yeah, look, this season, big improvements. What do you think has caught your eye the most as the biggest improvement?
Definitely the over the limit behavior. The fact that I can get around turn one completely sideways turn one at Red Atlanta,
Yep.
where that is actually probably where you can definitely see the difference of the car. If you push through that, like last season, you had to understeer through that corner. If you put any sort of yaw in the car, you were dead. So now the fact that even you can still die, but there's so much more you can do to save the car compared to last season. It's made a lot of these top drivers like myself and for him and Hendrickson and all those guys that drive the cars in that particular style much more comfortable driving at that limit.
Yeah, I wonder if they. I mean, there's a few people who said there's still a touch of the the rear of the car going despite counter steering. I wonder if that's like I've experienced that sense. Like it feels similar to what it was last season, but only I'm now questioning myself whether it's because I'm getting closer to that limit and I'm not used to the muscle memory involved in catching it. Like I can catch it to a point, but I feel like once it sort of reaches a tipping point, it's gone and there's nothing I can do. But there again, maybe that's how it's meant to be, you know?
Well, it is a race car and not a drift car, so they don't have oodles of locks. You've only got maybe 30 degrees of steering lock to actually play with. So once you get past the point of no return, it doesn't matter what you do. Like there's no saving it. But the car definitely reacts better if you counter steer and stay in the throttle. If you get off the throttle and pitch the weight onto the nose, you're pretty much a goner
Yeah,
still.
yeah, that's kind of makes sense when it comes to the physics part of it too, which was a big bugbear from last season, of course. How do you think it's affected the racing so far? I mean, I know we're only 2 weeks in, but what's your sense of it to this point?
Uh, I have more confidence in the car, and a lot of other people have more confidence in the car. So there's less of that procession style driving that we saw last season, where it was a lot of the first 2 or 3 laps definitely was tiptoeing because the tires were cold and deadly. Then it got to the point where the cars had so much grip it was actually really hard to facilitate a pass. Whereas now the cars have that grey area between that 95 and 105% of driving, where you can make moves into corners and make mistakes without completely dying. So you are seeing a lot more raciness in the first 2 weeks, definitely compared to what we saw last season.
Yeah, look, the other thing I think with that, one of the other changes they made was the tyre warmers and lifting the minimum tyre pressure. To me, that's a statement that there's still some work to be done, potentially, although I don't think anyone had run such low tyre pressures as they were allowing previously. But gone. You still have to be careful on the first couple of laps for sure, but gone are the days where it was, tiptoeing around procession-like style. Although, there were a lot less turn one or lap one pile-ups last season. So, there's good and bad in it, I suppose. But certainly for mine, the racing is immediately more competitive simply because there's, the car has got more appeal and has brought back a lot of the drivers that may have left us for a season or the season just gone. But what do you reckon? And one of the reasons why originally I asked you here before was your experience with driving on the edge. I know you do a bit of drifting and, know how to handle a car. How does the change or how do the changes this season line up to your experience in handling a real car?
It's definitely better. Like I said last time I was on, where the car reacted so unnaturally. Whereas now the car, obviously, it's still. I'll still spin. I spun in a race we had the other day, but I knew why I spun rather than going, well, I did everything right and it didn't work. I knew where I pushed the car too far and the mistake. I got punished for what I did wrong rather than getting punished for what I should have done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know, I know what you mean. So yeah, look, I haven't driven a race car in real life. I mean, done the go karting stuff like most people, I'm sure, but certainly the talk of the town from people that have suggests, I should say, that this is a step in the right direction, which is only a good thing. And I think people are voting with their feet or their seat time at least, and numbers are certainly up. Even though, there was a lot of commentary last season, and rightfully so, that the numbers in the skips were still pretty strong, given the absence of the top end of town, as I've been saying. But still, the skippies were fun to drive for the most part, and certainly now they're back to their best, some would say. But the other thing I've been thinking about with the changes is the balance of the car. I don't know your thoughts, Ben, but for me, we talk about grip levels, and in my mind, at least, I'm sort of picturing it or rationalising in it at the moment. I feel like the grip levels are heavily weighted towards the front of the car, and what it makes it feel to me like that the rear of the car is a lot looser. It means early rotation in corners is much better, and also, we talk about turn one at Road Atlanta, Road America coming up next week, the kink there out the back, even to some extent through the carousel. the rear of the car, even under full throttle, which is where you feel like you're adding weight to the rear and you're going to have potentially the most grip. You know, you're talking fifth gear corner, fourth gear in the case of Road Atlanta with some elevation change as well. You might have as much grip in the rear as you're going to have, but yet those are the points where you're worried about the rear grip or the rear of the car stepping out. So, you know, for me, in terms of the balance of the car, I feel like it's heavily weighted to the front at the moment, and that has, it means you've got to make some adjustments to your driving potentially.
Oh, for sure. But I don't know if it's the tire grip or if it's that aero changes they made. Because I find it's definitely more prevalent in high speed corners. Because I was still having understeer issues through turn 4 at Okayama,
Yep.
the long sweeper onto the straight, which is only a third gear corner, and I could understeer through that every lap of the race if I drove it wrong. Whereas if you look at turn one at Road Atlanta, sorry, or turn 5 coming onto the back straight, those faster corners is definitely where the rear end feels more skittish. So I don't know if it's maybe an aero imbalance rather than an actual grip issue.
Yeah, maybe I'm just thinking it's the tyres when, as you say, it's the adjustment in the aero. I wonder if they've added too much at the front or taken some away at the back. I don't know. Given that it's high speed where we're seeing the most issues, I'm wondering if they've taken aero away from the back potentially. I don't know. But it also seems to give this exaggerated sense of weight transfer to the front as well that seems to grip stuff up as well. I don't know what could have possibly changed that, whether that's, I don't know, something in the suspension that they've changed. That seems to be different this season, but certainly for me, I don't know what your experiences are, but it feels like the car shifts its weight a lot more than it used to, or at least it did last season.
Especially in big braking zones. So coming into the chicane at Road Atlanta or the hairpin at Okayama, you could, if you're going down 2 or 3 years worth of braking, you can feel the rear of the car even moving around. I've got the brake bias up to 54 at the moment just to try and stop the car being so skittish under brakes because I use a lot of engine in the braking as well. So it definitely feels like the car gets very light in the rear rather than being heavy in the front, but it definitely feels skittish.
Yeah, I had the same experience. Although I haven't shifted my brake bias, I've left it at 52, but I've seen a lot of people push it up. I don't know whether I just don't brake heavily enough. Although I was checking telemetry while I was doing some practice for this round at Road Atlanta, and I could see that I suspected I was braking too much for some of the corners, and I found that I was losing the most time because I was braking probably 10-15% more than someone like Johnny Gindy who did the VRS lap guide, you know. So, you know, maybe I thought I wasn't braking hard enough to make the risk step around, and then I say I'm braking too hard. But again, they were probably in faster corners as well, so it wouldn't necessarily have the biggest impact. But the other thing I was thinking about in terms of impact was, you know, it feels to me like setup changes have a little bit more impact than they have had in previous seasons. I mean, for me, I'm starting to wonder whether it's mental versus actual physical changes. What's your impression so far?
It's interesting because I've actually made changes between tracks like yourself, and also the fact that we're running two vastly different setups and running very similar pace in terms of like
Mm.
SPO and brake bias and stuff like that. But I've always changed the SPO, especially depending on the curbs at a track, trying to like, minimize front wing damage. But going with the front tire pressure changes at your suggestion and stuff like that, definitely. I don't know if you're right, if it's a placebo effect, but I definitely feel like there is a different behavior in the car when you make a change compared to some of the other stuff where you could run between 14 and 20 psi, and the only difference it made was the times you were doing rather than the way the car felt.
Yeah, look, for me, I have noticed a difference in the setups. For me, part of it's been in confidence. I know that I can go potentially faster with certain changes to the car, like lowering the front pressure so they match the rear, raising the SPO so the front of the car goes down. Certainly at Okayama, I sort of tuned the car a couple of times during the week, but moved to Road Atlanta, and as you say, taking into account the curb height, I was also really concerned about the rear of the car through turn 1 in particular. So for me, those changes were more about sort of controlling the rear of the car and essentially toning down what feels like excessive grip at the front compared to the rear. I mean, who's going to give up more grip? But when it feels like it's unbalanced, that's what I've been doing. But then I wonder, if it is just in my head, because as you say, we're doing similar lap times, and the differences between what our cars are set up like in terms of the Skippy, pretty significant. But I guess overall it speaks to the fact that the setups can make a difference, and it tailors perhaps to driving style, which I think sort of adds to the realism a bit,
Yeah, I find with this level of car, like so your Skippies, Mustangs, MX-5, stuff like that, you don't get a lot of speed out of a setup. The setup is mainly for a comfort to make you feel comfortable in the car, and the more comfortable you're in a car, the faster you're going to go. Whereas it's not like a GT car or an F1 car or something like that, where the setup makes so much of a difference to the way the car behaves around a racetrack that you need to drive it to the setup that's fastest for the circuit.
Yep, that's it. So it's interesting to think about the setups this year. Certainly for me, in relearning the car in the first it's been about 2.5 weeks now, if you include week 13. It's been interesting to see that it can actually make a difference. And maybe that's just me sort of getting to that level where it might make a difference rather than just, driving anything and taking what I get. So it's interesting. It's a work in progress nonetheless. The other thing we've seen this season, of course, with the Skippy is a lot of the, let's call them the big names, or some of the real top end of town, as I call them, coming back to the series. Some have had mixed feelings about the car, I should say. Weight of opinions expressed are overwhelmingly positive, but there are some who I wonder if they're just not willing to speak out against the chorus of support. I mean, I was certainly apprehensive myself at the start of the season, as the car was just, remarkably different. Different, I should say. I took some of my own advice certainly from last season and just stuck at it. But I'm finding my way now, and I'm happy. Certainly that there are some very strong drivers returning to the series. I had my rants and raves about them abandoning the series last season. I understood the reasons. I just didn't like seeing the series lose some of its fastest guys. But, I have to say, I reckon some of them, I don't know about you, Ben, but I reckon some of them are finding the new car a little bit harder to come to terms with than others, and certainly perhaps what they expected. What do you make of that?
I don't know if it's obviously the car is completely different to what it was 2 seasons ago. Like there's night and day difference. Like if you take away last season where the car was where everyone didn't want to drive it, the difference between the first season this year and now season 3 now, the car has completely changed. Like it is way more skittish. It's way more prone to off throttle oversteer than it used to be. Like that weight transfer onto the front definitely makes a massive difference. I think it's a combination of a lot of those guys went to GT cars, which again drive completely differently again. And they've spent the last 3 months honing their driving skills into a tin top. Now they've jumped back into the Skippy, which drives differently to what it used to, so they can't drive it the same way they used to. And that and a combination of maybe a little bit of rust, like watching DJ stream the other day, his first day back, and just watching the behavior of the car and the way he was trying to drive it like he used to drive it 6 months ago, where the car you just chuck it in and just like slide the car through the corner, but in a more of an understeer style slide rather than an oversteer slide. And watching the way the car reacts and his inputs on the limit definitely looked like it was driving the old car still and not quite coming to terms with the new car.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Someone of his talent, obviously having to make adjustments, and I wonder if the season off has hurt someone like Dennis and others who do have that level of skill and experience both on and off the simulator, and just sort of an impact that it has. I reckon give it some time and they'll be right up on the bleeding edge again, and it won't be that long before they do. It's certainly, with those guys back, it's feeling really competitive this season, every end of the race, to be honest, but certainly possibly in a different way to it was last season. There's plenty of talk that the racing was really close last season because the car was, air quotes, easier to drive. I mean, there's plenty to say that it wasn't easier to drive in my opinion, but certainly there was lots of close racing regardless. This season, the racing, I should say, is already heating up. A lot of the quick guys are back on track. The racing, certainly the ones that I've been in, I've done, nearly 20 races already. It's very, very competitive, really tight up the front. And for me, Ben, I don't know what your experience is, but qualifying seems to be becoming increasingly more important if you want to stick at the front of a race.
Oh, definitely. I found I was doing some no quali runs this week. I found earlier in the week when people hadn't quite got a handle on the car and the track combination, I could start 10th or 12th and be up near the front. Yeah, I wouldn't get gapped by the leaders before I got through the pack. But now everyone's got more comfortable with the car this week. I've had to start qualifying again just for the fact that I couldn't get through the pack and I was having some issues. But
Yeah.
the qualifying definitely makes a difference, and unfortunately, it does look like the quali hacks are still around from what we saw last season with this tire model, because the car definitely seems to gain grip with heat. So even with the tire warmers, Sammy's gone out and done some research to put it lightly. He's gone out and had a suss at the differences. It's definitely not the differences we saw last season, where it was worth upwards of half a second, 6/10 a lap. It looks more like it's closer to 2 or 3 tenths. But again, with the level of driving we're seeing again, especially with these big strength of field races coming around, 2 tenths is half the field these days. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see how quali goes.
Yeah, look, with the tyre warmers and the higher tyre pressures out of the pits, certainly the margins, as you say, are reduced. But I don't know, mate. From my perspective, I would rather see that there, the case that it is, than the short and quick or the down and dirty fix that they put in last season. It really just crippled qualifying for the best part, because what you had was one scenario where someone might choose to exploit the system a little bit to gain a small advantage versus everyone in the field. If you caught a half slide, you'd lose a second on your quick lap as a result. So I kind of feel like the balance is a bit better. It's certainly not perfect, but it's a bit better in those terms as well. But we are talking, really small margins everywhere on the track. But like you say, the no quality runs, I think now, because the margins are so tight, as you say, you might get away with it early in the week, but later in the week, you're just not going to bridge those gaps, particularly when, if you're aiming to be at the pointy end of the field, giving up that gap at the start, you're just not going to get it back. It's so hard, or it feels so hard to bridge a gap. And certainly I've found it that way. I guess when the times are tight, it's going to be hard, whatever the car drives like. But, similarly, or in difference to that, I suppose, it seems like whenever you race, you're typically finding a good battle out there, and that can be the one thing that either keeps you in it or takes you out of it, depending on where you are in a field. And if you think about the margins involved and get involved in those battles, that's where racecraft comes into it, and I think that plays a big part now as well. But it feels like the classic Skippy racing is back from that perspective as well. And there were people questioning whether or not we'd get tight battles at the front, or the gap between the fast and the not so fast would just increase with this car. But I think, as has always been the case with the Skippy, you can find a race wherever you go.
Yeah, definitely. The other issue, or not issue we've had, but the other difference that has been made is the draft has definitely been reduced.
Mm.
It seems it's not as linear as it used to be, whereas like basically if you're within 1.1 seconds, you had draft and that was it. Like you draft and you catch up. Whereas now, as I've definitely seen, is the first half a second is like the old Skippy draft, and then it really tapers off. You still pick up some draft at a second away, but nothing like it used to be. It wasn't like you just were in the draft zone and that was it. It definitely seems like there's more nuance to the way the draft works these days.
Yeah, it makes me wonder again about those aerodynamic changes that they made. I certainly feel it's not as strong as it was previously. It's strong enough to keep you in touch with similar pace guys and keep those packs together, but it's not, certainly not a guarantee to a pass on all tracks now. I mean, Okayama was a good example. You still had to make a move into the hairpin at turn 5, even with a decent run out of turn 4. you still had to earn it. The guy could still defend it pretty comfortably, and depending on how it went, you had a 4-5 corner battle on your hand to try and get a pass done. Now that's really exciting, potentially, particularly at the end stages of a race. But it can also be frustrating as well if you think you got someone's number and it's only by half a second or so. And the draft is enough to keep them in it. It can be frustrating, but that's part of Skippy racing, always has been. But I think the balance is probably a little bit better this season. What do you reckon?
Oh, definitely. So the way the draft works now is before it was definitely if you had a two car team or two cars driving together, you're always going to be faster than someone by themselves. Whereas you'd always leapfrog down any sort of straight. Like you could leapfrog down the second straight at Interlagos, which is a fairly short straight with a fast run up, so you don't normally get that strong draft. Whereas now, even two drivers working together may be about similar pace as someone fast driving by themselves, and that skill gap. Whereas if you were dragging someone along, if they could stay within a second and they had enough of a straight, they could keep up. Whereas even at Road Atlanta with the very long straight it has here, if you've got maybe 3/4 of a second race pace on someone, you can drop the draft just through the twisty stuff, which you definitely couldn't do with the old Skippy. With the two straights in a row, if they were within a second of you, they couldn't catch you. Whereas now, if they're more than half a second behind you, they don't get that super strong draft near the end of the tail that they had. So it definitely shows there is a skill difference, and you can drive away from someone with less pace than you more so than you could before. But if you've got someone that can stay within that half a second of you, even if they're not as fast as you, they can make a race of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Looking at Road Atlanta this week, anything up to 8 tenths previous seasons, you would have almost a guaranteed pass into the chicane. Like well before the chicane, you'd be clear. Whereas now, really 4 tenths, I reckon, out of the corner approaching, which I think is turn 7, if I'm not mistaken. I need to get that ready for the call tonight. But out of that corner onto the back straight, if you're 5 tenths is really stretching the friendship, but 4 tenths you've probably got a clear overlap and sort of past by the time you come into the braking zone or as you run down into the braking zone to the chicane. There's no more, double draft pass, leapfrog on the straight. And realistically, if you haven't got that sort of a gap, the draft is not enough for you to get clear. And if you're not clear and the other guy's not going to lift, your run's compromised and you're losing time to the chasing pack. And that's part of the point I think you were trying to make before, Ben, or you made before, was that, two cars these days are not guaranteed to be faster than one or a couple racing smart. If you don't get that clean pass and you have to go slow through that chicane, you've just wasted any advantage you got from the previous lap.
Yeah, definitely. And you see, it's going to be about people making friends this season and people not making friends because even the length of the straight that Road Atlanta is, if you've got that magic buffer of about 4 to 5 tenths, because if you're 3 tenths or closer, you're actually not going to have enough of a run to get past someone. You're going to get next to them and kind of stall out.
Yep.
But even with that 4 to 5 tenth gap, which is the perfect amount for an overlap, if the guy defending wants to huck to the inside of the kink and make you go the long way, you're not going to be clear. You'll have the inside for the chicane, but you're going to have to fight for it still. So it's definitely getting turned into a race rather than just pass and pass and pass and pass and fight it out on the last couple of laps. So it's definitely any lap you can defend if you want to give up the time that you're going to give up having to fight each other.
Yeah, look, it's another element that's added to the Skippy racing that makes a lot of fun. The stuff between the ears as much as the inputs on the pedals and the wheels. So it's good. It's a lot of fun. Overall impressions of this season's Skippy build, mate. Any closing thoughts on that?
So far, so good. If they keep going with the trajectory they are, by the time we get to the end of the year, I think we're going to have a pretty fantastic car to drive. They did have, of course, those issues which struck a few people, including myself, with the game crashing to desktop with the Skippy. But it looks like they have fixed that with that hotfix. I haven't had any issues since. So I haven't really seen many people having those issues. So it looks like at least when when it's an actual issue with the sim rather than a tire model, iRacing gets on it pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it didn't leak out into other series and they got it sorted pretty quickly. Anyway, yeah, look, my overall impressions, I started out very nervous and apprehensive. I had my best season results-wise, at least, last season, and I put it down largely to the previous build, many of those strong drivers being absent and not taking away those spots that I eagerly scooped up. Those like yourself, mate, who stayed and were somewhat hobbled by the physics of the car, also probably, someone who, like me, was suited to that build, who doesn't live so close to the edge, probably took advantage of that. Not in a mean way, but it was just the way the results went my way in that sense. It all added up to a really good season for me. This season, I felt like, perhaps I've parlayed the confidence from that and a little of the pace that I found during the racing last season into some improvement. I was still nervous before we got underway, and certainly the first time I hopped in the car. I mean, I did a lot of laps in week 13 and again in the first couple of weeks of the season thus far. I mean, it was focused, practiced. It wasn't just, turning laps, and it feels like it's really helped. But I feel like if I can make some sort of progress in this way, anyone can. So, folks, get out there and get amongst it. Now, speaking of getting out there, Sunday Night Lights is back. Round 1 saw us at Okayama for a pretty epic battle between some of the heavyweights of the series. From my perspective, the race itself was epic before it even begun. We had our strongest field ever. Strength of field was a tick under 4,500 and over 100 drivers taking the track across the SNL splits. We also had our largest ever live audience for the broadcast, which is fantastic. So before the racing on track had even kicked off, I really felt it was a fantastic start to our season. Now, round 1 also saw the return of Tim Hendrickson and Fahim Antoniadis, along with last season's championship contenders Vascalampi Grebstad and the eventual winner of that series last season, Sammy J. Toykala. Along with them in the front pack was your good self, Ben. How did the racing go? And we've talked about the Skippy, but how was the racing under those bright lights, and how was it in comparison to last season?
I had the best seat in the house last week, just sitting at the back trying to hold on. I am not the fastest guy in the world in a skip barber, especially compared to the likes of Hendrickson and for him and even Timu and Sammy. I found with the way that for him and Tim were driving, definitely slowing each other down the way they were driving. I was able to hold on, but it was a fantastic race. It was great to see two drivers being able to drive at that level and at the limit side by side so much, banging side pods and wheels and all that fun stuff. And of course, it was a great race to watch back on the live stream as well.
Yeah, man, they Hendrickson and Antoniadis, that is, they went hammer and tong throughout the race. There was very little quarter given, with some really strong lines, I thought, run in both attack and defence. And it was a good example of how skillful drivers can race hard throughout the race. And as you sort of indicated there, it didn't really cost them much pace either, which speaks all the more to their pace overall. Toykala and Vascalampi, along with yourself, were glued to the back of that leading pair until Vascalampi came unstuck through Piper in the later stages of the race. He put it into the wall on the outside of the exit there. And whilst there was 4 to 5 cars in that lead pack, it really did feel like it was always going to come down to the battle between Hendrickson and Antoniadis. Certainly even there was an opportunity in the middle stages for Toykala that did present. He was gifted a pass essentially on Antoniadis and took second place. It didn't take long for Antoniadis to retake the position and resume the battle with Hendrickson. It sort of spoke to me that perhaps those two just had the pace on the night and were never going to be touched. Ultimately, it was Hendrickson who took out the opening round, along with the largest haul of official points on offer for the week, of course, with the strongest official race for the week. A week that saw people flood back to the Skippy in droves. I mean, there were up to 9 splits of cars during the race, during the week, I should say, with 8 splits popping up on multiple occasions. So in my mind, the Skippy is most certainly back, and we are totally stoked to be a part of it here at the Top Split, of course. Eyes turn to Road Atlanta this week, tonight in fact, Ben, and you and I have both done a few races this week. What are you expecting from the SNL race tonight?
Oh, it's going to be a bloodbath. It's definitely a track of two halves. So you have what essentially starts at the chicane coming into the final section, through the first sector of the track, through the twisty downhill section. That's one half of the track, and then you've got obviously the straight between the straight out of 5, and then into 6 and 7, and then the big long back straight. So you're gonna have cars trying to break the draft. If you're smart, you're going to try and break the draft through the tire stuff and the twisty stuff.
Yeah.
And then you need to work together down the straight. If people fight down those two straights, if they're fighting into 6 and they're fighting into 8, I think the chicane is.
Yep.
It's all over Red Rover pretty much. It's going to be a case of these people needing to work together for sure, and racing with their heads. But it's going to be easy to get away if people fight. But if people don't fight and work together, we can see something like we saw last week, where we got 5 or 6 car packs all together driving.
Yeah, mate, and the decks will be shuffled once again. Look, I sort of tried to break down key parts of the circuit, but there's so many different parts to it that are crucial, I guess, to your race effort and your lap each time round. I mean, turn 1 will be interesting, with the rear of the car sort of looking to part company with the rest of it at any opportunity, depending on your inputs through there, and some of the stuff we were talking about with the change to the Skippy this season contributing to that. But it is, from a maintaining control point of view, the most challenging part of the circuit. It's also a passing opportunity, because you're flat knacker on approach there, and fifth gear corners or entry into corners are usually a good passing opportunity in the skips. Turn 5, the next one, after you've been through that blind chicane over the crest at turn 3, you come down into turn 5, and it's really a roller coaster ride of skill and courage, I think, to nail your line through there. It's one of the points that I was looking at this week where I was braking just that bit too much, and it was costing me a tenth or more. So it's another key corner there. It's also one that you can run completely off the rails. Turn 7, as we were talking about there, the most important, absolutely the most important corner, leading onto that massive back straight where there's a legit draft pass available if you get it right, and we spoke about that one before. Many drivers on that corner will be tossing up between first and second gear. Do you want the extra rotation of first, or do you want the rolling speed of second and managed rotation with the brake? Which will they go? Look, yeah, I know which one I prefer, but then each to their own. It's going to be traffic dependent as well. Then there's the final chicane. How many will go no guts, no glory moments, and how many of them will we see tonight as some of the top Skippy drivers have at it in those closing stages of round 2 of SNL? It's all to play for, and I can't wait. All right, Ben, that might do us for today. Thank you for joining me once again. I know you've been streaming a bit lately. Can you tell me and tell everyone where they can find you?
Yes, I have been streaming. I've been learning the ropes on that for sure, but it's been good fun. I am, of course, at twitch.tv/Snellovision. So like Smellovision, but with an N. I will be streaming tonight for the SNL and a couple of the warm-up races. I don't know if you're going to get this podcast out before that, or people will be listening to the podcast as I jump on. But I'm on a couple of nights a week, just giving it a crack, and it's good fun.
Yeah, perfect. Well, hopefully we can get it out before then. And it's always a good time with Snellovision, and some very quick driving to check out as well. So go check him out. As for me, I'll be live, of course, tonight, assuming we get this out on time, on Top Split TV on Twitch as well, for round 2 of Sunday Night Lights, with my co-commentator back, of course, the Chaotic One himself, Corey Steinhauser. We'll be there from 9:15 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time now, which is GMT plus 10 at the moment. So join us on track for the live broadcast on Twitch. join us on track or for the live broadcast on Twitch, one or the other. I suppose you can do both, multiple screens these days, I suppose. But if you are in the race, we'll be in the Top Split Discord server for the broadcast and the post-race interviews, so make sure you join us there. Broadcast replays are all up on the Top Split YouTube channel. Usually I put them on published for 8 a.m. my time, Australian Eastern Time, the following morning, so they'll be up there in full high definition glory. You can always find anything Sunday Night Lights or podcast related at the topsplit.com website as well. All those details, along with where you can find Benn's streaming adventures, will be in the description of the podcast below. Thank you once again for joining me, Ben. It was great to have you back, mate, and hopefully we can do this again at some stage in the future.
Thank you very much for having me.
Very good. Always welcome an expert-like opinion. The man knows how to steer. Thank you, everyone who has been supporting the Sunday Night Lights series. It's been a great start to the season, and your support is really very much appreciated. That about winds us up for today. Until next time, though, I've been your host, Alex McKellar, and on behalf of Ben Snell, thank you for joining us, and until next time, ciao for now.